It's Lent, and God is doing a new thing. I mean, we know that, but do we perceive it? You know, we're clear on the former thing that God did. God led us out of slavery in Egypt. You know, all those old people and the kids and the moms with the babies in their arms, just like we're seeing the millions of people streaming out of Ukraine. And then there was all that water in the way, right? The Red Sea or the Reed Sea. God made a dry way in the sea. This former thing is not a small thing. God freed us from slavery and led us to the promised land. Now that is a story to build a people around. That is a memory to hold on to. Because we are constantly losing our freedom to one thing or another in this world. To an autocratic dictator invading our land, to a pandemic distancing us from the people we love, to careers and kids and economic acquisition that narrow our choices to a single point. But our God is a God who never forgets, never abandons us, even when we give up on ourselves, as individuals or as a nation. Now, when this part of Isaiah was written, the Israelites were still in exile in Babylon. They had been defeated in war and sent hundreds of miles away across a desert to start again. They were there not for months, but for generations, cut off from the promised land, cut off from the temple, the center of their worship traditions. Their kids were intermarrying with the locals. They were eating weird food and celebrating new holidays. Not entirely sure that God was still with them. And yet they had the prophets with them, who made sure that they remembered the former things. And maybe, if they remembered the former thing, the exodus from slavery in Egypt, they could believe a new thing. That they would not have to stay in Babylon, but they could go home. Indeed, I asked Cindy to start reading at verse 16. Verse 14, a couple before that, says, "For your sake I will send to Babylon and break down all the bars." And what a new thing this would be, because it would not need a dry way in the sea. It would need a wet way in the desert. You can see why Isaiah would suggest that they could forget the former thing. The new thing would be so much bigger, so much better. But that was 2,500 years ago. And given that we're reading this portion of Isaiah the week before Palm Sunday, you might want to make the argument that the new thing Isaiah was talking about was Jesus Christ and the resurrection. But that was 2,000 years ago. It just feels like no matter what new thing we think Isaiah is talking about, it's a long time ago. It doesn't have very much to do with us. Through Isaiah, God says, "Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" The former things and the new things are connected, but they're not the same. Our faith is made up of those former things, that we were slaves in Egypt, that we were exiled in Babylon, that Jesus was crucified at Calvary and rose from the dead. But our faith doesn't stop there. Our faith reminds us again and again that former miracles are pushing us forward into the future. Our faith reminds us that ancient miracles are always being reenacted in always fresh and daring ways. We need to be shaken out of our default assumption that we have nothing to learn about God's activity, nothing to learn about what is possible with God. We've allowed our faith to thin out so much that we don't expect anything really new from God. What we want is for God to do something new, lay it all out there, and let us react to it. But that isn't faith. Faith is stepping onto the dry way in the sea and keeping going with all those old folks and the moms with the babies in their arms. Faith is stepping into the desert and heading for Jerusalem, not sure if there's going to be water, except that God said there would be a wet way in the desert. Faith is hearing about the resurrection after Calvary and living as if death has lost its power. Because when we live in faith, that is a new thing. Faith is not putting our wishes on a calendar and demanding that the world meet our deadlines. I'm not even sure from my corporate career if that's logistics. Faith is the confidence that God is holding the future open so that we can meaningfully participate. Faith is living our lives secure in God's presence in our life and death and destiny. When we perceive that new thing, all the former miracles of dry ways and wet ways pale in comparison with God's way through the wilderness of our lives. Amen.